Okay, so that's the plan. We're all going to converge together from different sides on the 27th. You're not going to attack unless you absolutely have to. You're just going to scout. Sounds good? And you're not going to take any extra men. Nope. What about artillery? Nah. Gatling guns? Nope. Well, okay. You are the expert, I guess. Yep. And didn't you write a book? North Dakota Times bestseller list. Okay, well, if there's... Wait. Who are you? Oh, hey guys. I'm Sitting Bull. Don't mind me. I'm just having a vision of your arrival. Well, that's awkward. What kind of vision? Well, there's a bunch of dead soldiers falling from the sky and landing on the ground, and there's a voice that says they have no ears. That's weird. Actually, as far as visions go, this is pretty normal. Oh, looks like vision's over. See you guys on the 25th. That was awkward. Extremely. So are you absolutely sure you still want to do this? Come on, it's a bunch of natives. What's the worst that could happen? Alright, so today we're going to be doing something a little bit different from what I normally do on the channel. And that is that so far I've talked about earth sciences such as volcanology and geology. I've talked about meteorology, I've talked about physics, I've talked about neuroscience and psychology, I've talked about chemistry and biology, and I've talked about conservation of the forests. But today, I want to talk about history. More specifically where I'm standing right now, which is the Native Americans know it as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, or as we know it, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Alright, so let's back up a minute. More specifically, 9 years prior to the battle, and that is 1867. The U.S. government at the time had come up with a plan to keep the natives in a certain place and then be able to have safe passage through, or to get lands where they could mine for gold or other things. So they created reservations, and we all know in U.S. history how that worked out. Not very well. So they made treaties with the Crow and several other people in the area, but they didn't make treaties with the Cheyenne, the Lakota, the Dakota, the Nakota, or the Sioux in the area. And those tribes were all nomadic and coming around. So the U.S. government used the pretext of coming and providing protection for the Crow and for the other nations against those others that were encroaching on their lands. And also from themselves. They were kind of like a mafia shaking down a store owner. It didn't work out too well for the store owner. Regardless of the circumstances, the Crow saw it as a good investment and ended up providing people to the U.S. Army as scouts, as liaisons, as interpreters or translators, and they just saw it as an overall good investment at the time. And over the course of the next 9 years, Custer himself actually led regiments in Missouri, in Kansas, in Iowa, in Nebraska, in South Dakota, North Dakota, in Wyoming, and now in Montana. So he was actually very experienced, but at the time when his 7th Cavalry was formed, his soldiers weren't. So 40% of his forces were fresh immigrants from Ireland and Germany who had come to the Midwest to get away from the East Coast as they immigrated and signed up for the Army. So they didn't really have experience. The other 60% came as veterans of the Civil War who had fought there in that type of warfare, then gone down to the South for 6-month stints to oversee the rebuilding after Sherman had burned it all to the ground, and then got shipped out to the plains. So they really didn't have experience in plains warfare or fighting with Native Americans, which is actually what we saw a century later in Vietnam. We had soldiers that weren't trained in the type of people or enemy combatants that they would be fighting, or the environment that they would be fighting in. So it was sort of a recipe for disaster before it even began. All right, fast forward 8 days prior to the Battle of Little Bighorn. There's another battle, the Battle of the Rosebud, and the commander that was in charge there of the U.S. forces sustained heavy losses even though he won. And so he came back and he told Brigadier General Terry that he was overwhelmed with the amount of natives that he was up against. Okay, so Terry comes up with a new plan. He gets everybody together and says, we're going to split up into several groups and we're going to message Gibbons. So we're going to encircle and take out all these enemy combatants. So he goes north with all of his forces to go to come in from the northeast. Then Gibbons is signaled to come in from the northwest. Custer and his forces are going to come in from the south, up the Rosebud. But Custer is ordered not to engage unless he sees absolutely fit. And at the time, remember, Custer is an expert. So, what do you think he did? You see, Custer's main objective from Terry was to be a scout, and so when he was asked if he wanted heavy artillery, if he wanted Gatling guns, if he wanted extra soldiers or reinforcements, he said no. They would just slow him down. All right, today's the day. June 25th, 1876, the day of the battle. At sunrise, the scouts for the group end up coming up to a place called the Crow's Nest, 14.5 miles away. And they didn't have telescopes, but from there, they could see a massive herd of ponies, and also what looked like some campfires from a village. So they reported back to Custer. Custer had a decision to make. Should he approach, or should he back off? Well, that decision was made for him, because his other scouts reported that his tracks had been found by other natives. Well, little did he know, those natives were actually leaving and never ended up going back to the village. But he decided to approach quickly before he had been seen. 2 p.m., the entire convoy comes up on a single teepee out in the middle of the plains. Inside, there's a dead Native American warrior named Old She-Bear, and he had been wounded in the Battle of the Rosebud 8 days prior. And so, the natives, per their tradition, had left him with all of his belongings out on the plains there. And so Custer, at this point, had to make a decision, and this is regarded as the point of no return. You see, on the hillside that I'm standing, he saw Native Americans, and he saw campfires on the other side, and he assumed that there might be a large village, and so he decided that he was going to attack. See, at this point, Custer was very experienced. He had been out here for 10 years, he had written a book about it, and he had found out that the Native Americans were really protective of their women and children, as I guess most people are. And so he had positioned his battles in the past next to the villages so that the focus was scattered among the natives of protecting their own and fighting at the same time, so he would be able to overwhelm them easily. Kind of messed up, but he decided at this point that he was going to split his groups up, come in by surprise, take the women and children hostage, and then force the Native American warriors to back onto their reservations without ever firing a shot. You see, Custer was not worried about facing an enemy force head on. He was more worried about, as they came in, a bunch of them would scatter and he'd have to chase them down with individual little companies and it'd be super disorganized. So, kind of a weird concern, but he had dealt with that in the past, and so that influenced his decisions now. So this is where Custer split up his forces into 3 main groups, and one company bringing up the pack train at a slower pace. So Reno ended up crossing the river and was going to attack from the south. Benteen was going to come up the north side at a slower pace and try to catch any stragglers that tried to escape to the east. And Custer himself would take his forces and go up the east side of the river to the north and try to cut them off on top. That was the plan. So Reno's detachment of approximately 100 men crossed the river over to the west bank and ended up heading up north towards the village, and their orders were to sort of flush them out. But his scouts came back to him and told him this was the biggest village they had ever seen. As Reno and his men made their way northbound, through the plain behind me actually, they came around the tree line and actually for the first time saw the scope of how big this village was. And Reno made the decision that would start the whole thing rolling. Reno's command was for his men to dismount their horses, and every 4th man would hold all the horses. So that meant 75 of his men were now in what's called a skirmish line, and their order was to fire into the teepees indiscriminately. So they did. And I cannot stress enough how bad of a decision it is to piss off your enemy, because within 1 minute, he had over 500 Native Americans for his 100 soldiers that were encircling his position on horseback, with spears, with bows and arrows, and with rifles. He was about to get his butt kicked. So what would any man do when faced with insurmountable odds? That's right, he ran the heck away. Reno ordered his men into the tree line and dismount and take up defensive positions, so they did. Now the Native Americans tried to flush him out by burning the brush underneath him, by shooting into the forest, by doing all kinds of stuff to get him out. They exchanged fire back and forth, taking heavy casualties, and Reno was so flustered that he was ordering his men to mount and dismount and mount and dismount, and he couldn't make a decision until that decision was made for him. See, Reno had a close personal friend and scout who was an Arikara native named Bloody Knife, and when Bloody Knife was sitting on his horse next to Reno and promptly got shot in the head and fell off of said horse, Reno decided it was time to get the heck out of there. Reno turned to his men and said, "All those that wish to make their escape, follow me." So Reno and several of his men mounted their horses and made their way across the river, climbing up to the ridgetop, which they actually left some stragglers behind who didn't have horses, and they ended up having to make their way through the trees, across the river, and then up to the top later on. Surprisingly, they survived to fight for the next 2 days. After narrowly escaping with their lives, Reno and his men rode up onto this ridgetop where he ordered them to dig in, and they did. They used knives, they used utensils, they used bayonets, and in some cases they used their bare hands to dig foxholes where they could dig in and fire down on the enemy. That's when Benteen and his forces, as well as the pack train, arrived at the ridgetop to reinforce them. So about 380 men reinforced this hillside and dug in for a long battle to come. Both Reno and Benteen had no idea what was going on with Custer because he was 3.5 miles to the north. All they could hear were rifle volleys, which at the time signaled that they were engaged and they would need reinforcements. Also, the bugler, Giovanni Martini, also known to them as John Martin, rode very quickly from Custer's position 3.5 miles away to their position to give them a handwritten letter from Custer himself, which said, "Benteen, come on. Big village, be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs." Benteen was later criticized for this, but he did not send anything to Custer's position, partly because his scouts reported that everyone in the in-between was dead, and also he was dug in, and they were besieged on all sides. Reno and Benteen would actually hold out on this hillside for 2 whole days until Terry and Gibbons arrived from the north with the main forces, and the natives retreated. But that begs the question, what happened to Custer?
Meanwhile...
So here's the hard part, is every single member of Custer's detachment died in the battle, with the exception of the bugler. So, how do we know what happened? Well, we have first-hand accounts from the natives who were involved in the battle, and we also have forensic evidence of where the bodies were found and what types of wounds they had. So here's what we've pieced together, and we know what happened, is that Custer, deciding upon seeing the natives mobilizing on the other side of the river and getting ready to come attack him, he decided to meet them head on. So he rode down this embankment all the way down towards the river with his forces, and they met Chief Gall head on. This decision to meet them head on would prove to be ultimately fatal for most of his forces, because Chief Gall, coming up from the southwest, outnumbered him approximately 5-1. So he immediately turned around upon having heavy casualties and retreated back up to the hillside, where Crazy Horse was waiting for him. You see, Crazy Horse had made the decision not to follow along with Gall's forces and attack up front, that he would travel north and encircle the enemy, and he caught Custer by surprise. Crazy Horse and his plan ended up overrunning Custer's position and killing every single one of them. And then they picked up the stragglers and went on to fight against Reno and Benteen for the next 2 days. So now that the battle is over, what did we learn from all of this? Number 1, don't underestimate your enemy. Number 2, just because you've done something the same way a bunch of times and it's worked out doesn't mean it's the right solution for every problem. Number 3, listen to the people around you. You can't see and hear everything, and they might give you a better insight or perspective, or you might be able to make a better, more informed decision. Number 4, and this is a 2-parter, either don't make one plan and count on it to work without enough information, or make multiple plans, put one into action, and be ready to switch to those alternative plans, because you're gaining information as you go. All right, so number 5, and most important, especially in our current climate right now, and that is always seek peace and de-escalation first. There were several instances in which Custer could have gone to them and made peace, could have talked to them. They knew him by name and by face, and he chose not to. There was an instance when Reno could have not shot indiscriminately into the teepees. He could have backed off, but he didn't. So, it is really important to de-escalate and seek peace. In 1926, on June 25th, 50 years to the day of the battle, White Bull, who was the nephew of Sitting Bull, and General Godfrey, both of whom had been at the actual battle, met here, and they shook hands, and symbolically, they took a hatchet and they buried it. So that's where the saying comes from. So now, like most battlefields, this is a place that is honoring peace and unity and how we can come together as people if we talk to each other, if we figure out our differences, and if we bury the hatchet. All right, guys, thanks for coming along with me on this adventure through history. Remember, like others. It's vitally important. Share an awesome adventure, and subscribe to A Better Way of Life. Now, I'm gonna go find some lunch. See you guys later.